So welcome back to class. Continuing from our discussion yesterday, we were looking at this transition that happens, that goes on to change quite literally and metaphorically the economic landscape of China. The transition would not have been easy, as we had discussed that the precursor to the transition was a set of bureaucracy or a leadership that was in favor of strict administrative controls, centralized planning, the fact that the state would have a say in deciding what was to be produced, how much of it was to be produced, how it was to be distributed, how it was to be priced. And the traditional socialist economy, as we left in the last set of discussions, was not simply a bureaucratic economy because of the fact that there were so many controls, but it was also a protected economy wherein key sectors were reserved for government actors. Now this we mentioned is something that was also continued when we look at the onset of economic reforms, in the sense that state control over sectors which had some kind of assured revenues, or where the market gave some kind of a captive consumer base, like for example telecom, or like for example the petroleum industry, or say for example banking and finance, or the defense industry, or tobacco for instance. So there were many sectors that still continued to be protected and in the control of the central government or at different levels of government. And the interesting bit was that, given the fact that bureaucratic control was the hallmark of the pre-reform era, it is quite easy to imagine why it would have been so difficult to push through reforms, because it requires a completely different kind of a mindset in order to sort of roll out reforms when control was earlier vested with different government officials. It would not be that easy to sort of relinquish that kind of control in favor of market actors, in favor of market mechanisms, knowing fully well that the market might actually send out signals where something that the state considers to be hitherto important was no longer reflected in terms of market demand, and therefore you might have a situation where a certain product or a certain commodity did not have any economic viability per se, right? So it was in this context that we had introduced our discussions. In terms of rolling out reforms, we had also mentioned that reforms were rolled out in 3 waves. The first wave being 1978 till about 1984. Broadly, if you were to look at the contents and if you were to pair it with readings such as Barry Norton's reading, one would get to understand that this first wave of reforms comprised experimentation, it comprised gradualism. Of course, these were hallmarks of the overall reform process. But when we say experimentation, we are looking at, for example, in the agricultural sector, with a policy which was known as the household responsibility system. Now, we are all aware that in the pre-reform era, we had seen agriculture, at least, and also industry, being organized in terms of agriculture moving from liberation of peasants, having individual plots of land, then putting together small plots of land into bigger cooperatives, which went on to become much bigger communes. And this particular tendency created a certain inefficiency, which we had discussed comes out of several factors, including disguised unemployment and so on. And so one of the first things that were part of the household responsibility system, the policy that was introduced as part of the economic reforms, was again allowing households to farm their own plots of land. The idea was that the state could not suddenly withdraw from the activities that it was earlier doing. So if in the commune the state was deciding what was to be produced, whether it was to be a cash crop or a food grain, if the state was to be deciding how much was the quantity that was to be produced, and therefore you have to, through supply channels, meet the requirement of the country. Here also during reform era, you do not find the state suddenly withdrawing. So what they did was they allowed households to farm on their individual plots of land, and whatever would have been the quantity or the quota designated by the state for production, that would be procured from the farmer at a certain price. Those of you who are familiar with the Indian agricultural landscape would be familiar with the idea of a minimum support price, which functions pretty much the way I've described this system of quota and procurement in the case of the household responsibility system in China. Now, as part of the reforms, the household responsibility system allowed for a certain production target. So very clearly it was not that the distribution channels in the state and the requirement of food grain overall in the country was anyway going to be reduced. That certainly had to be maintained. The idea was that over and above the state designated quota of production, over and above that, the household would be free to sell it in the market at a price that the market determined. Now, in this very description that I have given to you, it is very evident that there seem to be two sets of prices. My description here, where I mention that there is a certain quota that the state designates that the household has to produce, which would be procured by the state at a certain price. Over and above that particular quota, you could sell it in the market, and then you could retain the profits that you derived from whatever was the pricing that the market provided. Now, this was indeed a strategy of dual pricing, right? So this was one important aspect that is related to introduction of agrarian reform during the first wave. As the slide suggests, important initiatives were launched simultaneously in urban and rural industry, agriculture, foreign trade and investment. So there is, going back to some of the hallmarks we discussed, gradualism, there is experimentation, and very clearly these were launched not in a full-fledged kind of a rollout, but in an experimental kind of way in some parts. But of course, the reform that related to agriculture was known as the household responsibility system, and if you ask what was the equivalent in industry, it was called as the contract responsibility system, right? Now, the contract responsibility system pretty much functioned in a similar manner. The idea was that if the state had designated a certain output from industry, that particular quota would be procured, whatever is determined by the state at a certain price, but over and above that particular quota, if the industry or the particular state owned enterprise or the particular town and village enterprise, if it was producing over and above that, the managers were incentivized in a manner that, over and above the quota, whatever could be sold in the market, they had the opportunity to retain profits. While there would be one set of revenues that would go to the state, there would be another set of incentivization linked returns that could be retained. Now, I've told you two sets of incentives that were introduced at the farm level. households could sell over and above the state designated quota at a price that the market determined, and therefore there is an incentive that is built in there. At the industry level, it was known as the contract responsibility system, and pretty much incentivizing managers to also retain revenues which they could use either to upgrade their particular enterprise, or maybe to additionally increase the outlay that they planned in terms of the feedback that they would have got from the market, right? The second point here, incremental reforms of the agricultural collectives led to a system by which land was contracted to individual households. This is something that I described as part of the household responsibility system. The state, interestingly, remained conservative in maintaining ultimate ownership of the land with local collectives and in maintaining state control of marketing channels for agricultural inputs and outputs. Now, that's very interesting that the state is experimenting with reforms. If you ask me, why would the state still maintain control of marketing channels for agricultural inputs and outputs? Well, intuitively, you have to understand that if a household is given the option that over and above a designated quota, you can sell it in the open market and you can keep it for yourselves, whatever is the state determined quota, over that you can sort of sell it in the market and retain it for your own use. That kind of incentive may actually lead people to maybe stop cultivating food crops, and instead they might just be tempted to go ahead and cultivate cash crops, which might then produce some kind of an agrarian crisis. So that is the reason why the state continued to maintain some kind of control as far as the marketing channels for agricultural inputs and outputs was concerned. I mean, you had to maintain some kind of control, because if somebody was excessively now depending on fertilizers and other kind of chemical inputs just to boost output, then that might also create some kind of problem. So you have to keep a check on what kind of input is available. So up till a certain quantity it would be designated to be allowed, and over and above that there would be checks and balances that the system would place. Reform of the agricultural economy, household farming, which was part of the household responsibility system, that is how it was formally known as, and in industry, like I told you, it was known as the contract responsibility system. It greatly increased incentives to farmers. Now, the interesting bit was that you had roughly about 2 decades where the state had, on the one hand, experimented with the idea of pooling resources and putting together huge communes, and then you find that with reforms being rolled out, there is a very interesting phenomenon that again households are being given the right to sort of farm a particular plot of land, although the ownership of the land, as I mentioned, remained with the state, but now at least the household had the plot of land which they could use in a manner that after meeting a certain amount of state quota, they could use for their own personal sort of savings and other kind of growth. Now, the interesting bit here is that with more and more town and village industries emerging, now you have to bear in mind that in the previous model, you might have come across communes where there would have been backyard furnaces and industry was servicing the requirements of the particular commune. Whatever was the quota that the state decided, they would be sort of trying to meet that demand. But here, with reforms being introduced and a certain incentivization being introduced, you find that in an experimental manner, you have a lot of industries also now becoming very attractive for workers to move towards. Now, earlier, if I was working in a commune, whether I was allocated a task to be on the farming side or whether I was working in one of those industry related activities that was feeding into the commune work, it was creating some kind of a disguised unemployment, because you had to just meet the designated requirement of what the state wanted to be produced. But here, with incentivization and with the fact that you can now have newer opportunities in industry, there was a very interesting phenomenon that was playing out in China. Now, if you ask me what that was, I'd have to go back to a basic description of an economic model which has an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve. Now, if you look at a basic setup that involves an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, you would agree that the price level that the market provides is at the intersection of this particular demand and supply curve, right? Now, if all of a sudden I am dealing with a situation where communes are gradually being disbanded, where earlier households, if there were 5 members in a family, all 5 would have been working in the commune, maybe not to the fullest of their energy and their ability, and creating some kind of a disguised unemployment. Here I have incentivized agriculture and some kind of town and village enterprise. I have incentivized it so that earlier 5 members of the family who were previously maybe working not to the best of their ability and effort now have the opportunity for 3 members to maybe continue working on the household farm, and the other 2, because the economy is now running by incentive signals, and now you can earn more, you can go to the factory and actually earn more, meant that the other 2 who were earlier extra hands on the commune, now with this disbanded kind of reforms, the other 2 extra hands would rather work in the factory and maybe bring in some more money for the family, instead of continuing to work 5 people on the same plot of land. So what this meant was, this system of incentivization, coming back to my simple model of an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, meant that the supply of labor shifted to the right. Now, if you can imagine an upward sloping supply curve shifting to the right, where would the price level be? It would come down, right? Because when you have the intersection of demand and supply moves to the right, very clearly you have a lower level where the efficient outcome is provided by the market. What this meant was that for China, which was now experimenting with some kind of industrial reforms, they had a steady supply of labor coming in, hands which were freed from the communes. Secondly, the market itself, because of the increased supply, was giving this labor at a cheaper price. Now, anyone who wants to run an industry or an enterprise, the first priority for them would be acquiring a steady source of labor, and secondly acquiring cheap labor, because the contra to this would be that if I don't have a steady source of labor, how can I expand my industrial activity? And the contra to the other aspect of pricing would be, if the supply of labor is very high, if the price of labor is very high, then very clearly I would be very limited in terms of how much I can expand my production. I can only recruit so many workers as my budget outlay would allow. So it was a very interesting set of economic dynamics that were working, right? Whenever we discuss economic reforms, I think it's not just sufficient to say that, okay, by definition there is a household responsibility system and by definition there is a contract responsibility system. I think it's important to understand the underlying economic phenomena, which was basically that slowly as communes were being disbanded, there was a steady supply of labor that was being freed. That labor would then feed into industry which required cheap labor automatically got cheap labor because the supply of labor was steadily being freed across different communes, right? So the slide here suggests that reform of the agricultural economy, household farming, increased incentives to farmers, and the subsequent dissolution of the communes freed vast numbers of underemployed agricultural workers for work in emerging township and village industries, right? It's a very fascinating underlying economic dynamic that helps us understand how is it that these reforms succeeded. I mean, a lot of people might be wondering what is it that they did that allowed them to arrive at some kind of efficient outcomes. And so it should not surprise you that whatever they did, in an experimental manner, in a gradualistic manner, and in a pragmatic manner. Pragmatism was something that we've discussed in the previous class, wherein if something was not working out, they would have sort of allowed that particular sector to close down, or that particular enterprise to close down. Rural industries, again, it's important to remind ourselves, it was not that these were being created from scratch. I mean, there was rural industry. We have previously discussed that, in many of the provinces, maybe the output of iron and steel was actually going down because of the quality of iron and steel that was getting produced. So it was not that rural industry did not exist. They existed, but earlier they were constrained to serve, in a very narrow sense, the requirements of the commune, right? And that was the orientation that was there in the pre-reform era. But now, once you have a reform era mindset of incentivizing managers, so you can pretty much understand that if the managers are freed from the constraints of just narrowly serving the requirement of a particular commune, if they feel that there is growing demand for a certain kind of commodity or a certain kind of product in another province, very well they could expand production and make sure that once they meet the state quota, over and above that they could start selling to other parts, and therefore they were freed from the kind of narrow orientation that they had pre-reform to, in the reform era, a more freer kind of an approach in order to respond to market signals. Rural industries gradually grew to provide significant competition to urban and state-owned industry. Again, this is a phenomenon which is linked to our discussion yesterday, that ownership remained at all levels of government. So you're not looking at just rural industry competing with rural industry. Rural industry might be competing with some other state-owned enterprise that is owned by the central government, or it might be competing with some other provincial enterprise which might be set up in an urban industrial complex, right? So what this means is that gradualism, pragmatism, and experimentation were gradually producing economic dynamics, that being of competition. Earlier, you were free from those worries relating to competition because you just had to manufacture a jacket that was either in gray color or in black color. I'm just speaking figuratively. They just had like limited goals, whatever were decided by the state. Now they have to deal with a certain competition that could either be at the level of some other provincial enterprise or could be with some other state-owned enterprise. And the point here being that when you look at the functioning of the market, when you look at market giving you signals, this is the way they encouraged competition and inter-firm kind of competition that allowed for them to respond to market signals better. Factories were allowed to retain some profits and sell additional output over and above the planned target, and this prepared factory managers for more radical departures. Again, one can only sort of imagine that when you roll out reforms in a gradualistic manner, in an experimental manner, all of these would be like sequenced. Maybe initially the enterprise doesn't triple their production. Maybe it's just increasing their annual production by a few hundred units. Maybe subsequently in the next quarter they might feel confident to increase their output by another few hundred units, and by the time you have successfully completed a cycle of 4 quarters, you are fairly confident that in terms of manufacturing, say, a certain equipment or a certain commodity, that particular firm is better poised than maybe another provincial enterprise or maybe some other enterprise from another province, which allows them for maybe more radical kind of departures. The point here being gradualism, and the point here being experimentation that actually prepared factory managers for more radical departures. The contra to this would be suddenly asking the factory manager to double his output. That was not what was asked. It was not that they were suddenly put in a situation where somebody who was insulated from competition earlier is now made to face competition across different levels of ownership and then being asked to deliver results. That was not the kind of situation they were faced with. They were faced with a very gradual kind of an approach wherein they were allowed to retain some profits, meet planned targets, over and above planned targets would have been something that gradually prepared them for greater competition and also to deal with interfirm rivalry. Now, there's a very interesting dynamic that is also at play when we look at the rollout of reform in the first wave. Now, again, the first wave was timed between 1978 and 1984. Now, if you are familiar with the economic landscape across East Asia at that point in time, right, there are a few points which one needs to keep in mind even at the macro level. Now, I discussed a couple of micro level dynamics relating to how supply and demand would intersect, give you a certain level of price. If supply of labor increases, that means there is a steady supply of cheap labor. But there are also some macro dynamics which allowed these reforms to sort of roll out in a very efficient manner, right? What were these macro level dynamics? We are talking of the late 1970s. We are talking of the early 1980s. Now, if you look at economies that were in the neighborhood of China, and by then there were 4 designated newly industrialized economies who were also known as the East Asian Tigers. What were these East Asian Tigers, or who were these East Asian Tigers? There was Singapore, there was Taiwan, there was South Korea, and there was Hong Kong, right? And if you look at the level of development that these 4 economies had, by the 80s, you could imagine that Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, having passed through industrialization in the 1960s, tremendous amount of industrial growth in the 1970s, by the time you have enjoyed 2 to 3 decades of industrial growth that would have involved a lot of manufacturing, you would imagine that these economies, A, would have higher levels of GDP. That's very intuitive. 2, these economies had, over a period of consistent industrial growth, 1960s, 1970s, 1950s in some case, they would have enjoyed higher per capita incomes, right? So, consistently the economies around China would have been growing at a higher rate of growth. They would have been delivering higher overall GDP, they would have been delivering higher overall per capita income. Now, what happens when your neighborhood becomes richer and richer? So, in the context of China, just think of China in terms of just transitioning from agriculture to industry. Now, they are dealing with a transition to market-led reforms, which means that they are trying to incentivize agriculture, they are trying to incentivize industry. What would be the situation where industry in China is concerned? Would the managers be of very high managerial acumen? No, because they've just moved away from a state controlled kind of an economic ecosystem to a new kind of meeting the quota, selling above quota output, and retaining revenues. They would have just been dealing with market signals. And here is a neighborhood that would have enjoyed roughly 2 to 3 decades of industrial growth already. Once you have higher per capita income in your neighborhood, once you have higher levels of GDP in your neighborhood, bear in mind that usually in all economies what happens is that ordinary residents in those economies, they would start demanding for a cleaner environment. They would start demanding for maybe stricter implementation of laws. What do I mean by this? Say, for example, if there was an industry that was being set up in South Korea that was initially sort of highly polluting, then with 2 to 3 decades of economic growth, people are not going to continue with that particular industry being in their residential neighborhood. right? If you look at how many of our places have transformed, you see Chennai and you find that there is an automobile hub that develops outside of Chennai, maybe in Sri Perumbudur. You see New Delhi, maybe the time that I was growing up, there was a lot of industry in places like Karol Bagh, in places like Paharganj. Now, over the years, when people want a better standard of life, they would ask for industrial areas to be kept away from residential areas. So what you have in New Delhi is maybe industry and other kinds of activity shifting to the National Capital Region or the NCR, which goes to the periphery, right? This is part of all economies. This is not exclusive to Chennai and Sri Perumbudur or New Delhi and Noida, Gurgaon and those. These are phenomena that reflect how people's lives are changing. In the context of China's neighborhood, there was this drastic transformation that was happening. And when we meet in the next class, we'll discuss how this actually enabled China to continue with their experimentation, to continue with their pragmatism, to continue with the gradualism that allowed these economic reforms to take wings and deliver the kind of results that we will see China sort of enjoying in the subsequent years. So with that, I'll close today's discussion. More when we meet in the next class.